Welcome to the launch of our podcast. We are so excited to have you along for this journey. My name is Ann Madison, and I'm the Executive Director of Peace Restored. I will be your host as we discuss mental health and faith in our podcast, Seeking Healing, Finding Hope, a production of Peace Restored, a 501c3 nonprofit located in Indiana and serving women everywhere. Today on our podcast, we wanted to start out by sharing our story and our history and mission with you, as this may be your first time learning about Peace Restored. Or you might have even been involved with Peace Restored over time, and you may enjoy just learning a little bit more about us and the organization. Each week on our show, we will have at least one guest with us. This week, we have Angela Key joining us. Angela served on staff since 2017 as our Young Widows Coordinator, which serves a unique niche of women that have been widowed at a young age. Angela, a widow herself, serves the women in this group tirelessly, providing peer leader support groups, fellowship nights, annual holiday events, and annual retreats. Angela is an integral part of our team, and I'm excited to have her join us as our first guest. Thanks for joining us, Angela.
Thank you, Ann. I'm real excited to get to talk to you and start finding out, let the viewers and listeners know how Peace Restored started. And should be a pretty fun conversation we will have.
Yeah, I think it'll be a good conversation. I'm excited to have you as our first guest because you've been with me the longest. So it's been, which our guests will get to hear more about on the next podcast of how we met and everything. But yes, this is going to be good to get to hear how it all started.
Yes. So we've grown so much over these last years that I've been with you, last about 5-6 years. So I'm looking forward to see what we have coming up next and how God will direct us.
So I am looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today as well, because it'll be good for us to be able to talk about our past and where we've grown from, but also it'll be exciting to be thinking about where God is going to take us, as you mentioned, Angela. I'm just looking forward to all that is to come. And it has been an exciting last 7 years to almost total for Peace Restored at this point. Yeah, we'll be celebrating our 7th anniversary here in a couple of weeks. It's hard to imagine.
Yes, for sure.
I think in the early years, I thought, man, if we can just get past 1 month, we'll be good.
Now look at you.
I know. And then I think it kind of went to like, okay, I'll give us 6 months. Let's see if we can make it 6 months. It's just like a growth, a little bit at a time. And now here we are.
Yes.
Now we have this magnificent team that works together. And, we have Nolan here with us today too, sitting behind the camera, which, as he says, he likes to be. And so, we have a good team working with us.
We sure do. The staff has grown so much in the last, 2-3 years. I figured COVID would have stopped us, but we really grew through it, past it, and onward and upward.
Yeah, it's been kind of an amazing the last couple of years, because you're right. We had our moments during COVID,
did.
But God saw to keep us growing and to keep us stable, which has really been a testament to the Lord's provision over the last several years. But just to be able to have us to grow and to bring on our staff, we went from a staff of 3 prior to COVID to now we're this week a staff of 9. So that's kind of amazing.
Yes, it is, for sure.
So.
Well, can you start off by telling the audience how Peace Restored got started?
Sure. Well, as you know, since you've been with us this time, along for the ride, or it was like I said, like I like to say, you had a front row seat to everything that's happened.
Yes, I do.
We started in 2015, but Peace Restored really started out decades before that. So over the course of the last 6 years, or like I said, almost 7 now, we've had the privilege of seeing how God is writing my story and how he's using it to serve others through my pain. So about 40 years ago is when I feel like God really planted the seeds of Peace Restored. I was this little girl, and I had been through some traumatic experiences as a little girl. Some men outside of my family had entered my life and made the choice to sexually abuse me. Well, I know this is a story of many young women out there, and it does affect us. And it affects the way that we think and the way that we interact. And that's just what it did for me. It really began to shape the way I thought about myself. And I think a lot of times when we think about traumas and hard things, we want to kind of put a nice little pretty bow on it, say, well, that was back then. It's not today.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. But unfortunately, those traumas, they do stay with us and they do affect us for a long time. So this was just something that kind of, really began to shape the way I thought about myself and the way that I, like I said, the things I believed about me and who I am. I began to really struggle with things such as shame, isolation, fear, anxiety, and even at points throughout, even as a young teenager, depression. While I didn't have words or vocabulary for depression at that time, I didn't really know what it was. I just knew that I was sad. I knew that there was many times I just didn't want to be here. And so, those are just things that I just kind of would push down. Because as a young person, as a young believer as well, I just didn't quite know what to do with all that. So, like I said, I just kind of held on to it for a long time. I'd like to say that this, that experience as a young girl was the only time that happened, but unfortunately it wasn't.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that, if you'd like to share?
Sure. So, in about my preteen years, another man entered my life and the same thing happened all over again. He did all the typical things that we would hear about in forming a relationship, where he was grooming me, and I guess I began to believe that he wanted more than he valued me as a person, which wasn't the truth. He wanted to use me, and he wanted to be able to do things that no little girl should have to experience. And so, again, because I was older at this time, I held on to that really hard. I believed that one was my fault, that I should have known better. Yeah. Come on, I was almost 12 at that time. I should have known.
Still a baby, though.
I know, but when you're a kid, you think, "Gosh, I'm 12. I should know better." Or 12, 13. I was in that age range. But man, you're right. I was just a baby, but I didn't know any better. But man, my brain held on to that, and the way I thought about myself, I held on to that. So, one of my coping mechanisms is for those who know me will be able to understand this and say, I see that in you, is I like to stay busy. And that doesn't come as a shock to anybody who knows me. Now it's become more of not a coping mechanism, it's just the way that God's wired me. Yes. But in my younger years, it was definitely my coping mechanism. And it was the way that I was able to kind of push down all of those hard places and just get busy. And so I got married, and not to say that my husband was a coping mechanism that came out wrong, but I got married at a young age, and we ended up having children pretty quickly, and that became my focus. So I began raising my kids, which were my absolute joy, my every focus of raising them, and I loved having kids. I became a leader in my church. I began to homeschool. I did all of the mom things, right? I was just all in with being a mom. So my life was busy, and that busyness, like I said, just kept everything at bay, just kept the pain pushed down, kept me just focused on the here and now, and just kind of kept that stuff just a little bit in the past, a little bit secretive.
Yep, get that.
Yeah. It makes it easy when we do that, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So, but then there was this kind of perfect storm that happened many years into my married life, and that perfect storm created so much pressure on me that it just caused things to shift.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about your perfect storm and how you and your family dealt with that?
Sure. So during this time, our kids were getting older, not super old. I mean, they weren't little babies anymore. They were old enough to be somewhat self-sufficient. And my husband started getting migraines. And for most, a migraine something that lasts a day or two. Sometimes it'll be a week or so. But the experience that he ended up having is he ended up getting a migraine that wouldn't stop, that lasted for 2 years.
Wow. That's unimaginable.
Yeah. I had no idea that was possible or even a thing.
Right,
I was just like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean it never ends? He's like, it's just always there. And I was like,
ugh.
I don't know how he functioned. I really don't. I think he barely held on for those 2 years.
I bet.
He at that time he was working about an hour south of where we lived at the time, and he would drive an hour south, go to work, come home, and go to bed.
Yeah,
because that's all he had in him.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I know just having a small headache, it puts me down on the couch for a little bit.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, ugh. So we were going from doctor to doctor trying to find someone who could really help him overcome these migraines. And he started, unfortunately, having side effects to the medications he was taking. And so he ended up being allergic to almost every medication they prescribed him. And they weren't like little allergies, or like he'd have like paralysis of his face and things of that nature. So he was having anaphylactic shock on some of the stuff. So we're like, okay. So we kept trying to find other options. Well, we ended up many years, after going through, like I said, multiple rounds of different doctors, we ended up finding a doctor in Chicago that we traveled to that ended up hospitalizing him and help him kind of process through that. But during that time, that long journey of going to all those doctors, he started having things like fatigue, which, only makes sense, right?
Right, yeah.
I mean, like we saw in just one headache, I could be like, okay, I need to take a nap. I mean, this went on forever. And so it was fatigue. His body was in constant pain. He was having other issues such as memory loss. When your brain sits in that hyperactive state for a long time, it can cause memory loss for people, which is what he was having, short-term memory loss. He was forgetting things. He was also having hypersensitivity to sound and light. So if he was at home, we would have the room would be darkened. So we'd have like the curtains closed. We'd have the TV be on closed caption because any sound was too much for him. And so you could imagine for the kids, that just caused a little bit of tension in the house.
Right, yeah. Because they couldn't be rowdy kids.
No, they had to be quiet, closed caption, dark house. So Dad could rest. So it was quite a bit. It was a lot that really affected our family.
I'm sure it did. That would have to be really hard to deal with what you were dealing with at the time, and then, watching your husband go through that. So, how did that all affect you and your processing and your journey?
Yeah, so at first, and again, because I, stay busy, that's my coping mechanism. At first, I was good. I just kind of dove in. I did all the things and just stayed really focused on, I got to help him. I got to do what I can do. But interestingly, now that as I look back and reflect on it, is that as I got to the other side, as he started feeling better, I started feeling worse. Yeah. It was kind of like everything, it was almost like I let my guard down and everything came crashing in.
That had to be really tough. So you get him through his health issues. So then what was your steps to start your bounce back, your healing with everything that was going on internally with you?
Well, at first it wasn't healthy because I just knew I was kind of in this state of despair, if you will. I was feeling overwhelmed a lot. I was just in tears a lot of days, and I was like, ugh, I didn't know what to do with it. And so my first coping mechanism was I would just sit in my closet and I'd cry. I would just kind of separate, because I'm also, one of my other things I like to do for coping is I tend to isolate. I tend to pull away. And so that's what I started doing. I started isolating. Well, when you're struggling, isolation is not, at least for me, it's not a good thing.
Right.
So it really just grew all the stuff that I was struggling with. And I use the word stuff because at that time I didn't know what it was. I just knew there was something not right. I was hurting.
Yeah.
And so then after I started, my husband and I, we had like I said, we went back and forth to Chicago and to go to his doctor's appointments because we'd have to go every 6 months to keep up maintenance. And so what we started doing as part of that practice is we would schedule them around anniversaries or other special occasions so we could celebrate. We're like, hey, if we're going to be in Chicago, we might as well take advantage of it, right? And so we did that. And one of these times, it was close to one of our anniversaries. We'd gone up and we had gotten like a bottle of champagne or something like that. And my husband and I are not big drinkers. And so we brought the bottle home, we put it away. And usually we ended up throwing away the rest afterwards because, well, they would go bad.
Right.
But because I was struggling and because I had this in my house and because the things were getting so intense, I didn't know what to do with it. I thought, I wonder if.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder if I should drink a little bit. And so I did.
It's a slippery slope.
Oh, yes, it is. Yeah, but it was a slippery slope. And I would and so to make matters worse, I hid it in my bedroom. Yeah. So nobody knew I was doing it. So my kids would be doing their thing and Mom would sneak away and I'd go up to my bedroom and get my little drink. And because I'm not a drinker again, I'd cut it with some Sprite or something like that.
Yep.
And I'd go back with the kids. And as far as they knew, I was drinking Sprite. And I did that for a little while until one day I sat down and had a conversation with my husband.
It was probably a tough conversation to have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I still remember that he just looked at me and he just very certain. He says, we're not doing this.
Yeah.
He goes, let's go get this together. Let's go get the bottle together. And I said, all right. And we grabbed it. He's like, we're just going to dump it out.
Good decision.
Yeah, it was because I'm pretty confident of how that would have turned out if we kept going in that way. So I'm thankful that he was strong for me because I was not feeling strong in that moment. So I needed that strength around me.
It's good that you had him.
Yeah, it was so good. So we together made the decision not to have alcohol in our house for several years after that, just because I wanted to get to a place to where I knew I'd be strong. And that would never be a temptation to me.
Right.
So that for me, I think was a wake-up call, though.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. So I ended up starting going, okay, I obviously need to talk to somebody. I don't know what I need to talk to him about yet, but I'm feeling pretty miserable. Things are feeling terrible, so I need to talk to someone. So maybe I should find a counselor. And so that kind of started my journey of looking for a counselor.
So what was you looking for in a trauma counselor, and did faith have any part of your decision-making as far as finding a counselor? Because I know there's, for me with mine, we went to a biblical counselor at our church. So how did you go about doing all of that?
Well, I think at first I just knew I needed a counselor. And then I started to recognize that, there is this thing. That's what I would call it. So there's this thing that happened in the past. There was that. At that time, I couldn't even say the word sexual abuse, by the way.
I'm sure.
I had to learn how to say that, which might sound funny for some, but it was just something I was like, well, there was this thing that I went through and I probably should talk about the thing sometime. So maybe I should know somebody who knows how to deal with trauma. I knew to identify it as trauma. And then for me, faith has always been an important part of my journey. And so I wanted to make sure that I could find a counselor that came from that perspective. And so I began to look for someone that could deal with trauma and deal with faith. But that was kind of an interesting journey in itself.
I'm sure it was, because a good counselor is hard to find, and for them to be faith-based, they're even harder to find, I believe.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it can be a challenge to find someone who knows how to deal with trauma and knows how to deal with faith. Because what I ended up finding was these places that, okay, I'll help you work through your trauma and I'll let you talk about faith. Or it'd be the opposite is, I'll help you work on your faith and we'll talk about things from a faith perspective, but I'm going to let you talk about your trauma. I personally had a hard time finding somebody who could do both. And so I began to get frustrated with that process, and I kind of put together what I called kind of my little A-team.
Well, this will be interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So a disclaimer here is I don't recommend this. Like, this is not something I would ever recommend anybody do. Whenever I'm doing counseling with clients today, I always say, this is what I did. Please don't do what I did. That's bad grammar, but y'all know what I mean.
Yes.
So yeah, it was interesting because as I started going through this journey of meeting with different counselors, it was like I said, there were some that could work with trauma, some who could work with faith, some who only wanted to use the Bible. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll put together my own little team. So I got one of each. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure that kept you really busy, going to 3 different counselors and all the appointments.
Yeah, it's a really good plan, as I say sarcastically for those of you that can't pick up my sarcasm. It's because what happens when you're dealing with trauma and you're going into counseling 3 times a week, you end up becoming triggered. And that's exactly what started happening.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure that was, triggers are hard to get through.
Yeah, especially when the counselors don't know there's other counselors triggering you.
Yes, I'm sure.
When you keep the other counselors a secret from each other, it's not a good plan.
Yes.
So I learned from that experience. But the thing that ultimately came from that is I ended up learning that there needs to be a better way in counseling.
Right.
There needs to be a place where women can get both help through trauma, help through those hard places, whether they want to identify it with a trauma or not, and be able to integrate faith, not just talk about it, but be able to truly integrate trauma and faith together. Yes. Because if you've read the Bible at all, God is familiar. He knows what trauma is, and he knows how to help us through it.
Yes, for sure. Yes, I seek out verses quite often over that, and you always find your answers. He always has them right there ready for you. So as you were going through all these processes, trying to find your counseling, the right counselor, and trying to, get healing, what was going on in your world at that point?
Well, as I started processing through, find a counselor, one of the things I will say, I did ultimately end up deciding on one. So if you're listening going, gosh, does she stick with 3 the whole time? I didn't. I ended up going down to one counselor, one, because they found out about each other, and 2, because it was for my best.
Yes.
I needed to pick one. So while I was going through, my counseling journey, I also started pursuing my own degree in counseling and going back to school. So now I'm about my mid-40s, and I started pursuing a degree in psychology. While at that time of pursuing the degree, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with it, but God was really kind of planting those seeds of, I want you to use your experience for something else. So there was a kind of a lot going on in my world between going to school for counseling, and then I was going to counseling on a regular basis.
So all this was going on, and then you were going through your counseling and your schooling. So you were really busy. So how did all of that lead you to starting Peace Restored?
Well, like I mentioned before, is as I was going through that, I think God just kind of kept open my eyes to see more and more the sheer need for women for services in our area. Because, as I'm going through my own counseling, I'm going to different groups, I'm asking good questions and interacting with different people. I'm like, man, the need is so huge. And then as I started learning more and more about counseling, I just began to fall more and more in love with the topic of counseling and helping women through this process. And so then I started doing research and finding out like what is available. And I just, I began to realize just the sheer need. And then as I continued to heal from my own story, it became more and more apparent that it was going to be something that God was going to use to for me to share my story, and that through my story, we were going to be able to serve and help others. And so I began to work on kind of getting more and more comfortable with my own story, and then what God was doing through that. But as I was working through the counseling part, also the thing that was, I guess, important for me, or was a really kind of a flip in the healing process for me, is when I began to understand that God designed our brain in a certain way, and that He also designed our brain to respond to trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And He designed it to be able to heal from trauma too. But when I began to understand that there was an intent and an intent to how our brains react and act, a kind of a light bulb went on for me,
Mm-hmm.
and I began to heal differently, because no longer was the trauma. I could release myself from some of that.
Right.
I could now understand trauma differently.
So that was something that happened to you, but it doesn't define who you are.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that was huge. Like,
Yes.
this happened to me, and it caused some reactions in the brain, but it doesn't mean that's where I have to stay stuck.
Right.
Because one of the things I love about how God designed us is that He gives us the ability to heal.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say, well, I'm sorry you went through this, but it's going to define you now, like you said, moving forward. It's like, that's okay, I'm going to help you heal from it and through it.
Yes. And your story will help others through the process, which is great. So after learning all of this about yourself and starting to move forward, was this when Peace Restored got started, or?
For the most part, that's kind of where it started. Is 2015 of that year, I'd gotten to a place of, okay, I'm really confident in who I am, and I know what God's taken me through, and I'm ready to share my story. And so the first time that year is in July of 2015. I went forward and said, I worked with my pastor to say, I'm going to share my story for to everyone, and I went up and kind of ripped the Band-Aid off, if you will, and shared my story for the first time. And nobody knew I was going to do it. It wasn't like it was announced. It wasn't. People just didn't know, and so
Right.
it was kind of a shock to many. But it was such a powerful moment for me, because I knew at that time that, again, it was just another time where God was just like, this story doesn't control you.
Right. So you got up and you did your testimony in front of people who had no clue what had happened to you in your past. So how did that sharing of your testimony affect you going forward from there?
Yeah. So for me, I think it gave me a new confidence in who God had created me to be, and it helped me to see things differently. But then I think I was really surprised by some of the things that happened moving forward. After that moment, my husband and I had been praying through this process of what is it that God's taking us to, what is getting ready to happen. And so we had been praying through this, and we had the name Peace Restored before Peace Restored existed.
Nice.
And so right after I spoke, we got together a group of other people that we knew and said, hey, would you come alongside of us and be praying about this? Would you be willing to be kind of our advisors and let us bounce things off of you? And they were like, yeah, we're all in.
Nice.
And so we got this group together and we just started praying. And so shortly after I spoke, we had someone that came up and made an offer that kind of surprised all of us. So they came up and said, hey, I heard you speaking, and I'd like for you to consider this office space.
That really went from 0 to 60 in no time.
Yeah, because, and it was such a shock because we didn't talk about an office space to anyone. Like, my thought was like, I get a room at the church we were going to, and we'd like do something.
Sure.
It wasn't like, hey, get an office and start a nonprofit. That wasn't my thought yet. But it's neat how God works, and he's so patient with us to kind of put the story together and just say, I'm going to give you the next step and the next step and the next step until you get just where He has you to be.
Yes, yes, all in His planning and timing.
Yeah.
So this office space, were you able to go and see it, and how did all that happen?
Yeah, so we accepted the invite to go and see the space, and we went to go look at it, and we were quite pleasantly surprised of what it looked like. And we were given, as we were there, we were told later that there was a donor that would like to come in and cover our rent for the first 6 months as well. And we were like,
wow,
this is getting real.
Yes. Yes.
So then we were given 72 hours to decide if we were going to take the space or not. And so we went back to our team and said, hey, we need to be praying about this, and let's figure out if we want to take this or not.
Now, that's amazing how God just started opening up doors like that. So how were, how were you dealing with all of this? It was happening so quickly for you.
Well, I think I was in just a little bit of shock. I think my brain was probably going a million miles a minute. Like, what is happening? And so we just said, we're going to pray about this, because there's one thing that God had really laid on my heart the couple of years before we started Peace Restored is He had been really working with me to just trust Him.
Yes.
And I would say that before Peace Restored, I would have said, God, I trust you fully. I fully trust you. And He was like, no, Ian, I need you to trust me.
Yes.
And I was like, okay. And we went back and forth on that, but I can see why He challenged me in that area, because it was like, when this came up, it was like, hey, here's this space. And when I went back to like I said, I went back to the advisory board and we prayed about it. And by the end of the weekend, we were like, let's do it. I mean, everybody, there was not one hesitation. I'm like, okay, this is a step of trust. This is where God's calling us to, is just to trust Him.
Yeah, that's amazing. So what were the next things that happened after you had your office space?
Well, we accepted this space, and that was, by the way, so I spoke in July of 2015. We accepted the space about 30 days after that.
Yeah.
And we were told we could move in November of that same year, so November of 2015. And so I went back to our team and I said, hey guys, I think this is great that we're going to have a space, but I don't think we can furnish it with a couple folding chairs that I have. What are we going to do? I can't buy any furniture, so...
Right, yeah. Upstart, no money.
I don't have any money. We weren't planning on starting this. I don't have anything set aside for it, right. So how are we going to furnish it? So their response was, we should pray about it.
Yes.
I'm like, oh, okay, let's pray about it.
Yes, and then God answered in a big way.
Oh my gosh, He did. So so one of the members on the prayer team, or the advisory team, whichever you want to call them, they called me or emailed me, says, hey, Ann, there's this group that's giving away some furniture. Why don't you call them up and just see if they'd be willing to help you. Their objective is to give stuff to churches, but maybe if you tell them what they're doing, they'll be willing to work with you. I'm like, all right.
Yep, worth a shot.
I mean, worst they can tell me is no,
That's
and I still have no furniture, so might as well try. Yeah. So I called them up and said, hey, my name is Ann. I'm trying to start a non-for-profit. This is what I'm doing. And I told them, like, we're going to help women, and we need furniture. I mean, it wasn't a really good sales speech, but that was kind of the crux of it.
Yeah.
And they were like, okay, come on over. I was like, oh. All right. So I showed up at her door and they were like, all right, so back there's some office furniture. And I mean, I'm like, there was a lot. And like, here's a stack of Post-it notes. You just put your name on it. You can have whatever you want.
Wow, that's amazing.
I was like anything. And at first I kept like asking her, I'm like, are you sure? Because I mean, it felt strange because I mean, I'm literally shopping with a stack of Post-it notes. Like, sure, go ahead and put your name. I'm like, are you sure you don't have more people? She's like, if somebody else, she was like, don't worry about it. You just take what you need. I'm like, all right. So we still have quite a bit of that furniture today.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, it's nice. It's nice furniture. Very durable.
It wasn't like it was furniture that was falling apart. It was.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah. So we were blessed.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. So So we went and shopped with Post-it notes, and we picked up the furniture and stored it all in our house for a couple of months. My family was very gracious about that.
You have an amazing family.
Oh, yeah, I think they're pretty great. They've been such good supporters through this whole journey.
Yes, they are. It's fun to see them at events and really pitching in, and especially Brian. He's just amazing, very supportive.
Yeah, he's been all in from the beginning. It's been amazing.
Yes, I love talking to him about Peace Restored too at events, because he gets so excited. And he's just all in. I
don't always get to hear that part because I'm usually running around. Peace. He's been all in from the beginning. It's been great.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's just a great story to hear that how the starting of Peace Restored has went. And even though I know you and I have sat and talked about it a couple times, because I know we have paused on several different occasions and look back and reflect and just praise God for how amazing He is. To Peace Restored, and for every client and every staff member that comes through the doors, it's just been amazing.
Yeah, it's been more than what I could have imagined, better than what I could have planned, of all that's happened in the last nearly 7 years.
Yes.
I think if we would have sat down, if you and I would have met back in 2015, if we would have sat down together and tried to come up with a business plan, it wouldn't have came out anywhere near to what's happened.
Yes.
It's been above and beyond what I could have imagined this being. Yes. And I can't imagine what the next 7 years is going to be.
Yes, me too. I mean, we've got big plans, and I know your vision of, where to take Peace Restored is just awe-inspiring and very exciting to see stuff, in print, and just to see what the future goals are. And I know with God, it will, He will lead us and lead you, and, it will come to fruition. Whatever He has called Peace Restored to do, it will happen.
Yeah. It's been, this has definitely been a work of what God has called us into and called us to do. And we're privileged. I think it's a privilege for us to be able to walk alongside the women that God ordains to be in our path.
Yes.
And it's been a privilege to be able to lead this organization and to be able to see how God has chosen to bless and to help us to continue to move forward. I wouldn't say it's always been an easy journey.
Yep.
But it's been a rewarding one.
Yes, for sure. It's always rewarding to help others and turn back and help others that are coming up behind you, and their stories that are similar to yours, and just to have, just to be able to bless others along the way. It's more rewarding than any career or job could give you, because you're doing God's work. Man, we just think about the number of women that we get to touch. And there's people that, because of technology and things like we're doing the podcast now, and we've done things on social media and different things, where there's people that we get to impact that we have no idea. Yes. And that's amazing to me. I think about women that we've worked with in other countries, and we talked to women in Uganda and South America and Argentina and just France and just all these places. Like, how in the world? But God. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So this has been fun. Yes, it's been a great conversation about the start of Peace Restored, and gives everybody the history and how it came, came to be. Yeah. So. Well, I'm excited for our next podcast, and I hope all of our listeners join again as we continue to learn more about Peace Restored. It has been fun to learn how God has allowed us to grow. And so today our mission is to serve women impacted by abuse, trauma, and grief. We have had the privilege of serving over 450 women from 2015 through 2021 from 10 Indiana counties, 6 states, and 4 countries. But we aren't stopping there. Yes.
We have big plans, as Angela mentioned, to serve and equip women that are hurting. And this podcast is just one of the ways that we are here to serve you. So over the next several podcasts, we're going to continue to share with you how we have grown in our mission of Peace Restored. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about us, go to our website, which is peacerestored.net. You will be able to find the link in our show notes along with a few video links. Then we'll begin to share with you practical ways that you too can seek healing and find hope. On our next podcast, you will learn more about our stories and hear the story of how Angela came to be part of our staff. So come back next time to hear our stories of transformation, growth, and power. This is Peace Restored.